Chris Mannix, what has to happen, do you think, for the Sixers to go on a run at this point?
Well, there are a few things. I don't think they're wed to one. The rotation's got to be figured out. I mean, right now, Brett Brown's kind of all over the place with what he's doing and who he's mixing and matching lineups, which is understandable. I mean, they changed up their entire team twice this season. Jimmy Butler and then Tobias Harris. So that's number one. The shooting from Ben Simmons, from unsuspecting outlets on that team, that's got to happen. But if I'm looking at the number one thing, it's got to be Jimmy Butler being assertive in the fourth quarter of these games. Jimmy Butler, his shooting numbers are down a little bit since he came over from the Timberwolves. He's only taken about 13.5 shots per game. He did take 16 last night. It was only 5 for 16 from the floor. But in the previous games, if you look at some of those numbers, it's 7 shots.
It's a lot of 11 and 13-point games.
Yeah, and like, he's the one guy on that team that has to be able to take over games late in it. He's the only guy really that can do it. I love Joel Embiid. You can go through him quarters 1 through 3.5. Ben Simmons can go to the basket, create offense. But if you need one bucket, it's got to be Jimmy Butler going to get it. And if he's not, they're not going to have much of a chance.
One thing that I think that they're able to see with Joel Embiid being out, because I believe that Tobias Harris is an underrated scorer, because not only you can run offense for him, but he can get his shot, go off the dribble, can get to the rim. I like the ability to be able to experiment with him, because Jimmy Butler, I understand that, and I respect that. And I think Philadelphia did a great job after the first trade. Those first few games, when it came down to crunch situations, they called Jimmy Butler's number, and he came through. I like the fact that let's reestablish that, because we've made another change on this roster, trying to get the feel for it. But I like the fact in these last 20 games, let's reestablish Jimmy Butler as he's going to be our guy to close out, because you're going to need in the playoffs. Man, they call it different. You need a veteran player, and I can understand why you would say Jimmy Butler is the only guy outside of Joel Embiid, because Joel Embiid's going to draw some fouls, but what type of whistle is he going to get in the playoffs? Jimmy Butler is that X factor. He can be the closer.
He didn't get those whistles last year against Aaron Baines in the first round. He didn't get those whistles.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Baines, because he's on the Boston Celtics, and this is where the key is for the Sixers, is that they are staring at, it would appear, a potential first-round matchup with Boston. Now, with no Embiid, the Boban injury is big, by the way. They would have lost to Miami last week if Boban didn't have a monster game. He has been very good for them in spots. With no Embiid and no Boban for the next few games, we would imagine, their next 2 games are OKC and Golden State. Like, okay, so you're without your best player, without your backup center, you're already a thin team. So that would be very easy for them all of a sudden to flip-flop with Boston, 4-5 to 5-4. And we know that Philly, for all of Boston's struggles, Boston sure seems to have Philly's number over the last couple of years. There are some issues there, right? So how can they change it this season in the playoffs? The answer is what you said, is Jimmy Butler. Because late in playoff games, Jimmy Butler is what every great team has to have. A guy you do not have to run a play for, a guy you can clear it out for. It is what the Celtics were missing last year without Kyrie Irving in the postseason. It is go down the list. It is what the Rockets have with Harden, what the Warriors have with Steph or KD, a guy who can just go do it. I like Tobias Harris. I don't love him as my 2 minutes left in a 3-point playoff game. Give it to him.
Absolutely. I can understand that, yes.
And so, and Embiid, it's tough to run those plays for centers. Even when Shaq was in his prime, it's tough to just dump it down to him late in playoff games, because guys just wrap you up and say, you know what I mean, beat us at the free throw line if you get the call. So Jimmy Butler's the key. And the reality is Jimmy Butler, the best part about him since he came to Philly has been he hasn't seemed aggrieved by his lack of major role, but he actually needs to take on a bigger role down the stretch in late in games. We said this a few weeks ago. It's true today. The first 3 quarters, you said it just right, Mannix. First 3 quarters are Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons' time. The end of games has to be Jimmy Butler's time, because that's also when Ben Simmons will become a liability, because you're going to be playing 5-on-4, because he's not going to provide the outside shooting. And as much as I like what J.J. Redick has done, before they got Butler, they were running the end-of-game stuff through J.J. Redick because they had no other option, which shows their limitations in that spot. So the answer is absolutely Jimmy Butler.
How much does it help the Sixers that the Celtics are struggling? And there's, you don't know when Oladipo's coming back with the Pacers, so there's a little more wiggle room.
Oladipo's done for the year.
Okay, so there you go. So, I mean, there's a little more freedom and leeway there on the top of the East.
You know, but the Celtics have owned them, but the Sixers haven't been good against anybody at the top of the East. I think they're 3-8 against the top 4 teams in the Eastern Conference, and they'd only have 4 games left against them. And look, the sense of urgency in Philadelphia has to be sky high right now because for a lot of the pieces involved, there's a ton at stake. I mean, Brett Brown at some point has to prove he can win at a high level in the postseason. The Sixers ownership group is preparing to spend maybe the most money of any team in the history of the NBA if they bring all these guys back and eventually max out Ben Simmons. If you get knocked off in the second round, that might give everybody else kind of reason for pause. Jimmy Butler, if he struggles with this group in the playoffs, what does he do? Does he decide, look, maybe this isn't for me. I'm going to take my talents on a 4-year contract somewhere else. So you can say it for a lot of the teams in the Eastern Conference playoffs, Toronto, Boston, but Philadelphia might have as much stake as anyone in this playoffs.
And you mentioned in the second round, if Indiana, to their credit, despite no Oladipo, is staying strong.
And their schedule stinks in the next week.
If Indiana stays in the 3 spot, then Boston or Philly, one of them's going home in the first round.
Yep.
And so that's the other reason why it's not just
I would be shocked if Indiana was able to hold on to that 3 spot.
I would be too.
But their schedule, like they have the next 5 games, I was looking at it, they should win all 5. Like they could go 5-0 in the next 5.
I would be too, Chris, but I thought when Oladipo went down, they were going to fall apart that moment. Instead, they have won at the same level without him as they did with him. It would be very interesting to see the final quarter of the season if they can hold that spot there.
All right. Thanks for watching. Subscribe here to get the latest from the show. Also, be sure to check out more of the best clips from First Things First, or go watch a few segments from our other shows on FS1.